This week, we are getting into responsive design. And you'll notice that lesson 11 actually spans 2 weeks because of Thanksgiving. And this is actually a large lesson. It's lengthy. Do not wait until the last minute to begin this lesson because you will not get it all done. The lesson is actually split into 2 different parts. The chapter in the book that covers responsive design is also a little lengthier. It's chapter 5. And we are going to specifically take a look at 2 different CSS layouts. One is called Grid View and the other one is called CSS Grid. And I've split this into 2 different lecture demos, mainly because there's just a lot of information here, and having it split into 2 sections will help you, hopefully help you, keep grid view separate from CSS Grid, because the names are similar, but the way you set them up is not similar. So we start with mobile web and grid view. The mobile web concepts that are covered apply to all mobile layouts, not just grid view. So we talk about what responsive design is, and it's basically the idea that if a site looks good on the phone, it'll also look good on a tablet, and it should also look good on your desktop. Okay, so you want it to look good on all devices. You want it to be responsive. Flexbox that we looked at earlier in the semester is a responsive layout, but it does not give you as much control as Grid View and CSS Grid. So first concept that you need to understand for responsive design is the concept of a viewport. And basically, a viewport is the visible area of the page on whatever screen you are looking at. So if it's a phone, it's the portion of the page you see on the phone. If it's an iPad, it's the portion that you see on the iPad. Okay. So it's the portion of the page that you're viewing on whatever screen you're looking at. And in order to make your page responsive, there is a viewport meta tag that you need to add to the top of all of your pages. And this goes between the opening and closing head section. Probably the most important thing that is in this viewport meta tag is the initial scale. I remember when I first started designing long ago, I made the mistake of not using this tag. And this little example with this teeny weeny little text and graphic, that's how my page looked. And then I discovered the viewport meta tag and the initial scale. So if you use this tag, everything looks pretty normal and you can actually read it. So super important tag to include in your pages. Another little concept that you need to understand with the viewport, which is the screen, is scrolling. So in general, it's okay to scroll vertically, but you do not want to have to scroll horizontally, which means that you don't want large fixed width elements. Like you don't want a large graphic with a width set in pixels, because that will force people to scroll horizontally. Okay, it is better to use percentages because those adjust according to the viewport. There is something that you're going to be learning. It's called a media query, and it does check screen size, and then you can have different sized images display on different screens. That is a workaround. What's a little bit more flexible, as I mentioned, is using percentages for widths because those are relative values. And if you use pixels, those are absolute values. 800 pixels for a width does not change, okay? Whereas 80% for a width, it is going to change, okay? So this little table shows you different measurements for relative widths. And a lot of them are used for text. Percentage is kind of universal because it can be used, for video, graphics, text, pretty much anything that you put on your screen. I do have a little PDF that you can take a look at here, talking about absolute and relative lengths. It is actually a pretty good explanation of the different measurements that you could run across. And just to give you an example of what some of these look like, I created basically some paragraphs using these different settings, just so you can kind of see how they differ. Okay, and then we get into some mobile design layouts. And we talked about Flexbox already. This particular lecture demo goes through grid view. And grid view basically divides your page into 12 columns. And so you can actually kind of visualize a grid. And then what I usually do on paper is I kind of jot out where I want my content to fall in this 12-column grid. And if you want to see that page live, it is located right here. Okay, and you can kind of see how this adjusts. Okay, and so that is grid view. And if you right click, view page source, you can actually see the code that was used. So to build grid view, the first thing that you're going to do at the top of your CSS is you're going to set everything. That is what the little asterisk does. Sets everything to box sizing border box. And this is going to impact the widths. Border box includes the borders and the padding with the content in the width calculation. Okay, so everything should be using border box. And then you're going to set up classes. So .call1 is a class, .call2 is a class, and you're going to have 12 of them. And so how this works is 12 is 100%, and 6 is 50%. And you'll notice that when we lay out a page, everything is going to, within a row, is going to add up to 100%. Okay, that's kind of the idea. And you can actually copy and paste this. And then you're also going to do a little layout here that's going to affect everything. And we are taking each column and we are bringing it to the right of the previous column. So that's what float left is doing. So it's just going to pop the column up next to each other. And you'll notice that we did set padding, but because we have this set to border box, that is all included in the width. So all of the CSS for grid view is right here. And this is going to allow us to do 12 columns that will be responsive. So how do we apply this into our pages? Well, you need to figure out what portion of the row is going to be how many columns that portion is going to occupy. So if you think back to our lovely vertical Acme page, the menu portion, if I wanted that to occupy 3 columns worth, and then the rest of the content in the page can have the rest, what I would do is in the navigation tag, I'd set the column to 3. And if we look up here, we can see that's 25%. Okay. And then I would set the section with the remaining content to the class of column 9, because 3 and 9 equal 12, right? And 25% and 75% equal 100%. And 100% is the width of our row. So that's kind of how it works. With media queries, so you can check for a specific width, screen width, and then you can change the display. So in this particular example, if the maximum width is 600, which means it's a smaller screen, the width is going to be 600 or less. We're not going to display the sidebar. With this one, maximum width is 480, so that tells me it's a phone. Okay, and the layout that we want for a phone is we're going to set all of the widths to 100%. Okay, so it really doesn't matter what we did up here. Okay, if it's a phone, everything is going to be 100%. Here we're doing something a little different. If they change the orientation to landscape, we're changing the background color. So you can literally do whatever you want with these media queries. The media queries are designed to check the device that they are using. And then you make changes, and the changes are to, your CSS based on the device. And so what breakpoints are different media queries that you set up to check for different devices, basically. So in this little example, my default up here is for mobile phones. So my default is that every column class is going to have a width of 100. That's my default. Okay, then I check for a minimum width of 600. So if it's not a mobile phone, then we're going to use these widths. Okay, and then it's checking for a minimum width of 768. So if it is 768 or larger, it's going to be a desktop and it's going to use these widths. And remember, CSS is cascading. So it's going to start with this. And then let's say we have a width of 1200. Okay, so it's going to start with this, and then it's going to go through here and 1200. Yeah, it is bigger than the minimum. So then it'll use this. But when it comes down here, 1200 is bigger than this minimum. So this is what it ends up sticking with. Okay, CSS is cascading. So in your classes, if you have a situation like this where you have a little different width for a tablet versus a desktop, you don't have to worry about setting the default because that's going to happen automatic. What you need to do is add classes for the tablet, and you need to add a class for the desktop. Okay, and so that is what the example is showing you. Now, I'm not sure if you guys have ever tried to print web pages, but the fact that graphics and color and all of that stuff prints is kind of annoying if you're printing from home because it's expensive. So you can actually create what's called a printer-friendly page. You can have CSS that removes the pictures, changes everything to black and white, removes all the bells and whistles so that it's just plain old text when they go to print. Okay, so this is an additional CSS page that is just for printing. You can also control where the page breaks. So you can have it break before or after a certain point in the document. Okay, so here I've got an example where in the detail section, I'm telling it not to do a page break. So if you remember, we've got summary and detail. The detail section should all go together. So here I'm saying, don't do a page break in my detail section. Now, what I could do if, depending on what I had in my page, I could tell it, to always page break before, because page break before is an option. So I could say page break before always, which would make it do a new page on the detail section. Okay, so you can totally control where those page breaks go. Now, once you have printer-friendly CSS, you actually have to have two links in your head section. You have to have one for the screen and you have to have one for printing. It is super important that you add the media attribute, and it needs to say media equal print and then media equal screen. Okay, that will tell the browser when to use the different CSS. Okay, so you need two of them and you have to tell the browser when to use it. And the remainder of this document gets into setting width, responsive widths on images. And as I mentioned earlier, percentages are pretty awesome. And if you set something to 100%, it does not mean that it's going to take, the width of the screen, because most images are located inside containers like sections or paragraphs. It will take on the width of the section or the paragraph. Okay, and you can also set a max width property to 100%, which means the image can scale down, but it will not be bigger than 100%. So if you are concerned that the image will look pixelated when it is enlarged, if it gets too big, you could use max width. There is also a picture element that you can use, and you can actually have different sizes, and you can use little media queries inside here to indicate when the different sizes should be used. And that is kind of a cool option that is pretty new. We've already talked about the background size. The ones that are responsive are cover and contain. Those are the two responsive sizes for page backgrounds. We get into video here. For the video, if you set the width to 100%, the video player will be responsive. This includes iframes. Okay, so any width of 100%, you could also use max width if you want it to be able to be smaller, but not larger. And when you're doing this, do not set the height. Leave the height set to auto, which is automatic, or you can actually omit the height setting altogether because you want it to remain in proportion. Okay, and so that's pretty much the discussion on responsiveness. I did include a little section here on CSS frameworks. In our classes, we do cover Bootstrap in the 200, some of the 200 level classes. But all Bootstrap is, it's just CSS classes, pre-formatted. So If you learn the classes that are in Bootstrap, you can add them to your page and it does all the formatting for you. W3 CSS is similar. Okay, you just have to learn the classes that it has set up. You have to pull in the library and then you can use them. As far as marketing your page goes, obviously there's word of mouth and social networking, paid advertising, following links to reach pages, and you can also submit your page to internet search engines. Okay, those are all different ways of getting your page on the web. Another thing that you can do is you can do search engine optimization. So there's a lot to search engine optimization. There are entire courses on this. But some things that you can do in your own pages so that they will be at the top of a search list is make sure you're using the HTML5 semantic tags. Make sure you put text in the title tag. Your title tag should contain keywords for your page. In the content of your page, some of the words in your first couple sentences should have your keywords in it. You can add keywords and a description using a meta tag. You can include your keywords in your heading tags. You can include the keywords in the image names and in the alternate text. Okay, and when possible, it's good to have other people link to you because then the search engine software will find you and incorporate you into their database. So as far as the meta tags go, there are two that are used for searches. One is for the description and the other one is for keywords. And you'll notice that both of them use the name attribute and they both use the content attribute. Okay, and the idea behind the description is that when you see a list of results from a search, it will use this text as a description for your page. For keywords, the idea behind the content is anytime they key in one of these words, your page should be on the list of results. Now, there are always people who do not want their pages indexed for whatever reason. And there's a meta tag you can add if you do not want your page indexed. Okay. And for more on this, there are free courses from Google you can take. I also have a link to an analytics tutorial and a digital marketing tutorial. Okay, some additional resources for you guys. So that is part one. Part two, CSS Grid. So immediately you can see that this is a little bit different than grid view, okay? Because we've got columns, we got gaps, we have rows, and we have gaps. Okay, so and this is just one of the grid layouts. Okay, so there's different ways to set up CSS Grid depending on the grid layout that you're using. So if you were going to do a layout like this, you'd have a grid container, and then you'd have grid items. And your CSS would define the two classes, the container and the item class. And the container, it says display grid. Okay, and then you have to tell it how many columns you're going to have. So grid template columns is indicating here 3 columns. Auto, auto, auto means 3 equal width columns. Okay, so that is basically how you set it up. The rest is just, coloring and all that kind of fun stuff. So with the columns, you can do auto, or you can actually specify different widths. Okay, totally up to you. If you want to, you have 4 columns and you want specific sizes for 3 of them, you can use auto for the other one. Okay, the measurement for the columns is pixels. And here is a live example if you guys want to try that out. In addition, you can align cells within the grid area. Okay, so this is going to look a little flexboxy because we had alignment options there as well. So we have horizontal and vertical alignment. We can also control the size of the gap, which is the space between the columns or the rows. And what we were just looking at were column definitions, but if you prefer to go by row, you can do that as well. And you can specify the gap for the row. So here we've got display grid, we've got grid gap, and we've got the columns. Okay, here we've got display grid, we've got our columns, and we're saying grid row gap. Okay, that's because we specify row, that's why there's no gap between columns. With this particular layout, you can merge columns if you want to. And that is typically done in your HTML. You can actually give it a starting number and an ending number, and it will merge your columns. Here is basically the same thing, but it's a little shorter notation. So this is just basically saying at grid column 1, I'm going to span 3 columns. Here at grid column 2, I'm spanning 2 columns. Okay. Grid column 2, I'm spanning 2 columns. Okay, so there's just several different options as far as how you write this code. So my recommendation is that you guys find a technique that you like, because I've got tons and tons of examples in here. Okay. And the one that I like, that I use, is this one. It's actually a template that you create. And so you create little classes for the different areas in your page, and then you give the grid area a name. And then in your container, you say display grid, and then you define your template. So you take these areas and you lay them out, okay, indicating where you want the different content to go. So it doesn't matter how many of these you put in a row, okay? So I've got heading in my first row. Then you'll notice that I take the menu and I span a couple different rows. It's the first item. Okay, so positioning is important here. So you have to be kind of consistent on, the number of columns. So each one of these little headings you can view as a column. And so like in the first column, second and third row, I've got a menu. Okay, and then in the third row after that, everything else is contact information. In my middle row, the first column is a menu. The last column is my right area, which is aside information. And then I've got the content in between. Okay, so like I said, this is just kind of personal preference, how you want to set this up, but it's super flexible. The only problem I have ever seen students have is they forget to use the same number of columns in each row. So each one of these is a row. Each word represents a column, and you just have to be consistent in the number of columns that you have in each row. Okay, and so once you set this up, you do have to remember to add the classes to your HTML. Okay, and then it's going to take your HTML and organize it so that it matches your template. So that to me is super cool. So which one is better? CSS Grid, Grid View, or Flexbox? Honestly, I think Grid View is the easiest to use out of the box. Flexbox, because of all the options, it makes it a little bit harder. And I would say CSS Grid is also a little bit harder because of all the options. Which one do I like best? I like Grid View and I like CSS Grid. Those would be my two favorite. And I actually really like CSS Grid because I think media queries are a little bit easier to do. So here is, I'm a lazy typist. So instead of doing long grid area names, you can see I just use letters. But laying this out for me, for mobile, tablet, and desktop, it actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, so to me, I am using a different layout for phones than I am for tablets, and it's visual. So I can see, okay, this is my heading. This is going to be my menu. I've got, let's see, my content is here, my main content. I've got a little aside and my footer. Okay, and so here I've got the heading. You can see I've got main content in a couple different rows. And I've got menu. I've got the aside and the footer. Okay, so you can kind of see how I have this set up. And for me, it's visual. You can use letters, you can use names, whatever you use here is what you have to use down here in the template area. And so I have an example. So this is CSS Grid. Okay, and you can see, so this would be phone. This would be tablet. This would be desktop, but super responsive. Okay, and then here is the CSS. And then down at the bottom is typically where you would put the CSS Grid information. And for printer friendly, you can do that as well. So you can have your own little grid for the printer friendly content. And usually that is more like a mobile because you want the widths to be more like 100%. Okay, but it's pretty easy to use once you get used to it. Now, for your textbook assignment, you guys are going to get to use these different layouts. So you're going to take an existing site and convert it into a responsive grid view. So that Acme vertical from lesson 10, you're going to be copying the entire folder into lesson 11, and you're going to be changing it so that it is responsive. And you're going to be adding the grid view layout to that, which means not only do you change the CSS, but you need to go in and edit all of the pages. Okay, and so this editing of the pages is important. Otherwise, they will not pick up the responsive classes. Okay, and then also adding the meta tag to the top of all the pages, super important. Then there is a site that you are going to download. It's a Zen spa that I made up. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be adding the CSS to make the site responsive. And then you're going to be adjusting your HTML. to include the responsive classes. You're also going to be making the site printer friendly. So you're going to take that same Zen Spa and you're going to create a printer friendly page. And then finally, you are going to add attributes for SEO to the Zen Spa. Okay, just to give you practice doing that. And then this little demo, make sure you watch the video. It actually shows you how to view your pages using Chrome. You can actually view it on simulated devices. Okay, so that little video shows you how to do that. And then I have another page you're going to download. And for this page, you're going to convert it into a responsive grid using CSS Grid. So this is the one where you're going to be using the template areas. And mobile, tablet, and desktop are going to look different. So I kind of did little screenshots here. So you can see what mobile is going to look like, what tablet is going to look like, and then what the desktop should look like. And those are screenshots. Okay, so you're going to go through. And at that point, once you complete Seuss, you are done. And you're going to upload all the pages. Then for your lab, you're going to create your own responsive page. And this page can be modified for your term project. So I would take my time and do a really good job on this because a lot of the requirements that you have for this assignment, you also have for your term project. And you have a choice of using CSS Grid or Grid View. I actually did the page in both. Okay, and so you can right click, go to View Source. You can see I've got Screen and Print CSS, and you can click on them and view the code for each one. As far as the contents of your page, you can do it on whatever you want. Okay. Other examples would be the Zen page and the Seuss page. Okay. So you guys can literally choose whatever you want for these. You don't have to do it on inspiration. It should be something that interests you. Okay. And then I've listed out the requirements for the assignment. Okay. And as I said, this can be used for your final project. So I would take your time on this and do a good job. Okay. Because it is something that you can reuse. Now, once you're done with that, just like you shared your form, I want you to share your responsive page. So this is very similar to the form discussion. You're going to pull up your responsive page. You'll click in the address bar and do Control-C for copy. You'll add a new discussion topic and you'll say my responsive page. And then you're going to click on the link. You're going to paste the address, pressing Control and the letter V. I usually open in a new window and create the link. That will let people look at your page, and then you're going to answer the questions that I've posted. Okay, and then once other people post their own pages, you can reply to at least one indicating what you liked about the page. Okay, so that is the assignment. And again, this is 2 weeks. Do not wait until the end of this 2-week period to try to get this done, because there is just too much to do in 1 or 2 days. Okay, you need to give yourself some time to absorb all of this material. And you want to take your time, especially on the lab assignment, so that you do a good job and you can use it again for the term project. If you have any questions or you run into problems, let me know. Have a great couple weeks and happy Thanksgiving.